Okay, so I mean, that's the visitor visa in a nutshell. The vast majority of the work that we do is employment related under the general employment policy. So, the test for approval for an employment visa I've couched as the employment visa approvability test. And the approvability test is that the applicant needs to possess special skills, knowledge and experience of value to and not readily available in Hong Kong, but not China. And moreover, the employer must be justified in engaging the services of an expatriate as opposed to the services of a local person. Now, the employment visa is administered under the general employment policy. And to be deemed a professional under the employment policy, to pass this test, at a very minimum, you need to be a graduate and have 2 years post-graduation working experience in a managerial or supervisory capacity. If you are not a graduate, then really the Immigration Department are expecting to see 10 years experience in a managerial or supervisory capacity. However, because there's so much flexibility in the way that the Immigration Department implement policy, you can, on occasion, find situations that fall between those two polarities, and you can argue it accordingly and be successful. And let me give you a simple example of how that worked many, many years ago for me. I had a 18-year-old junior high school graduate who was working for his father's farm in Japan. And what they did was they grew eels. They were eel farmers. And his father's business was associated with some Japanese consortium that had some very interesting eel farming technology. And they'd done some licensing deal with an enterprise in Shenzhen. And the farms were all in Shenzhen. But the operational control of this joint venture was based in Hong Kong. And they wanted to have this kid come to Hong Kong and be responsible for this venture. And you think he's 18 years of age. What's all that about? So I said to the client, I said, look, you know, you're just simply not going to get approved under any circumstances unless you've got something really, really unusual about you. So tell me about the business of eel farming. So I discovered that actually, if you know anything about chicken sexing, does anybody know anything about chicken sexing? When you are, I'll just digress for a moment. When chickens are born in an industrial sort of facility, the chicks are taken out of the hatching trays and then they're put onto little conveyor belts. And then there are people that stand at each side of the conveyor belt and they pick up the chick. And when they pick up the chick, they have an intuitive sense of whether that chick is a boy or a girl. Because you can't tell, right? There's nothing to look at. And then they separate them, and then the males apparently go off for eating, and the girls go off for hatching, giving more eggs out. So there's an intrinsic sort of, skill, if you will, about chicken sexing. What transpires that in the world of eel farming, there's an intrinsic skill that's very similar, and that is that you can pick up a batch of newly hatched chicks. It's not chicks. Eels, whatever, the baby eels, and that depending on how briskly they flip their tail, I kid you not, then you can tell whether or not they stand the chance of being grown to sort of full size for harvesting. And if they're genetically weak, they'll never get to that size, so they can the batch. And apparently this kid had that skill. So I went, this was pre-internet now that I remember, I went off and did all the research on this, and apparently it's completely true. So we made the argument, and lo and behold, the Immigration Department said yes to him. Now there's a caveat to this, because about 7 or 8 years ago, I was giving a talk on behalf of the Institute of Human Resources Management here, and the Immigration Department actually asked if it would be okay for some senior officers to come in to listen to what I had to say. And I told the story to that audience at that time, and afterwards, one of the officers came up to me and he said, I remember that case, I was on that team, and he said he was always going to get approved because he has special human talent. Human capital, human capital. So there you go, the approvability test calls for special skills, knowledge and experience of value to are not readily available in Hong Kong, Normally we're looking for, a university graduation, and normally some working experience in the wake of that. But you can, on occasion, have a very set of circumstances that's going to give you the opportunity to make your client smile when the visa comes in. So that was one of my more notable approvals down the years. Okay, but more generally then, the body of work that occurs in respect of employment visas. About 18,000 Hong Kong employment visas issued to foreign nationals each year. And if you look at that body of approvals, it tends to break down into three particular types. And depending on the type of applicant they are, you can then understand you can go into the application with a certain level of confidence that they're going to get approved easily, or they're going to have to be really, really argued strongly, or it's going to fall somewhere in the middle. So effectively, if you've got a situation where there is an intercompany transferee maneuver happening and the guy's a graduate or he's been working for that company for 10 years or so, for all practical purposes, these applications are just a walk in the park. It's pure administration. On the other hand, you may find yourself, as we often do, with an applicant before us who's been hired locally. He's here as a visitor and he's deemed to be really the right man for the job. But because the way the approvability test works, the Immigration Department expect that there's some sort of assessment as to whether or not these skills can be found locally first. Interestingly, you don't actually need to advertise in advance, in my opinion anyway. Because if you advertise in advance, I think you're making an admission to the Immigration Department that you can find these skills locally. But nonetheless, the Immigration Department will always, if you have a locally recruited expat, have something to say about the possibility of these skills being found locally. Now, it depends on the case, it depends on the skill set of the individual, it depends on the nature of the work, it depends on all the circumstances. But in any event, I always think that when you go into a locally recruited expatriate situation, you have to be ready to argue the case, which is somewhat different from if you have an intercompany transferee situation. And you find that cases get refused, and I'll touch upon this later on, cases get refused where a company has appointed some local HR staffer to do the employment visa applications for their foreign national staff. And that, they've gone on for 3 or 4 years and they may have done a dozen or so applications. It's been completely cookie cutter and there's never been any issue. And then all of a sudden they get a refusal. And normally when there's a refusal, it's because the HR staffer hasn't understood that there's a world of difference between doing an application for an intercompany transferee and an application for a locally recruited expat. And then the third set, or third type of applicant that you tend to find in this visa class are those cases where there's a job offer, there's a job opening here in Hong Kong, and for one reason or other, the employer has decided that they are going to hire from overseas and they're not going to hire locally. And unless these guys are, for example, the future chairman of the HSBC, or they're going to be the CEO of Cathay Pacific or something like that, you can find the Immigration Department frown upon or look askance upon employers locally that are actually recruiting from overseas for deployment in Hong Kong. Again, if it's a very large, a very sizable organization, the Immigration Department are never going to second guess the recruitment determinations of a company in that regard. But for all practical purposes, you've got to understand that the Immigration Department don't like this stuff, so you've got to be ready to really go for it and really argue it. So in the final analysis, it's just about the amount of time and the amount of work and the amount of effort you put into an application to work with the information that you've got before you. But all of the employment visa applications that we've seen down the years tend to fall into one of these three categories, and it's important that you understand, where it sits on this sort of admin argumentation axis.
So I don't understand the difference between these two types. Locally recruit expat, does it mean some expatriate visitor?
Yeah.
You recruit them, or does it mean that this expatriate is already being employed by a Hong Kong company and you transfer to your company?
Both.
Both. Okay, and so that one is overseas, recruit overseas.
Yeah.
Not recruit by the local HR from overseas.
They may have been recruited by the local HR, but You've got
advertisement overseas.
or whatever, or they've hired a headhunter or whatever it is, but they're not in Hong Kong, they've got no connection to Hong Kong, and they decided that they want to bring this person in from overseas to do a particular job.
Okay, but not much difference from that one if that one is a foreign visitor just fly in Hong Kong and find jobs.
That's true. But normally, when you're arguing the locally recruited expat situation, there's some local dimension to the application because this expat's here locally. So to try and separate the two, if you had come as a visitor 1 week before you make the application, you've only ever been in Hong Kong for a week, then that instance is the same as a specifically recruited expat. Yeah, because what you find actually is that by the time applicants come to you, they've kind of been here for 9 months, a year or so, you know, testing the market and looking for work, and they've inculcated themselves into the sort of the social fabric of Hong Kong. Yeah, and the Immigration Department know that they've been here at this time as visitors, and you actually articulate that as part of your story in any event. But it's the instance where, hey, we've got this job opening, but we think that there's nobody in Hong Kong that could ever do this work, so we're going to hire from overseas. And there the Immigration Department say, fair enough, but justify it. Okay, any other questions? Again, these are just my categorizations of trying to break down an amorphous sort of blob of different work experience that you see on a day-to-day basis.
What are the chances of the overseas fresh graduate working locally?
Unless you're a very, very sizable employer, and I'm talking publicly listed, then the chances of them getting an employment visa is almost zero. Because you need at least 2 years post-graduation experience in the managerial and supervisory capacity. So if you're freshly graduated, no. Because the department say, why? Why shouldn't we offer these opportunities to our local graduates? And I think that's quite reasonable. Further considerations generally in relation to an employment visa application. The application form, the sponsorship form that accompanies the application, the ID 990B, seeks to satisfy the justified limb of the approvability test. That is, you've got a section on the ID 990B that gives you an opportunity to state your case. Actually, what we do is we prefer not to use the forms themselves. We prefer to encompass the entire argument in a separate letter. And there's a template in the Hong Kong Visa Handbook that sets out how you would go about structuring the framework of the argument to that extent. If the sponsoring company for an employment visa application is completely new, then the Immigration Department will look to the bona fides of that new company to see if it can be deemed a suitable and credible sponsor. And as you'll see when I talk about business investment visa applications in a short moment, effectively, if you have a new company situation, there are 2 tests that need to be addressed. The first test is in relation to the individual's special skills, knowledge and experience of value to not really available in Hong Kong. But then the Immigration Department, if it's a new company, will look to the bona fides of that business that's seeking to sponsor it, and they will say, can this business make a substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong? And what this means is that you can't, in a sense, just go and say, well, right, what I'll do is I think I'll create a new company for myself, and then I'll extend a job offer to myself, and then in the context of that job offer, expect the Immigration Department to give me a visa because I'm employing myself. Well, as you'll see, there's a way that you can accommodate that dynamic, but it certainly isn't the instance that if just because you've incorporated and that entity is extending a job offer, that immigration will say, okay, that's fine. They do look to see new companies and within themselves, are they justified to be a sponsor? Can they themselves make a substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong? So they're looking at that as part and parcel of the overall application, wherever there is a new company being put forward as a sponsor. You submit your application and you can be in Hong Kong as a visitor. You submit your application while you're in Hong Kong, but you submit it on an entry visa basis. So it's possible for you to be in Hong Kong and you can submit your application. It used to be that you couldn't be in Hong Kong and submit an application if you were physically in Hong Kong. You had to leave and you had to submit the application from while you're physically outside of Hong Kong. But these days you can submit your application while you're here as a visitor, and you can wait out the application consideration timeframe until the case has been finalised. And at the point that it's finalised and it's approved, then the Immigration Department will issue a visa label, and then in that case the applicant needs to take himself or herself off to Macau, relinquishing his visitor visa status at the point of exit. He has lunch, puts the visa label on a clean page in his passport, and then comes right back in, and then his entry visa is activated at the point of arrival, and he's now here as an employment visa holder. So it is possible to change his status, but it is actually done on an entry visa basis. So that's how you go about submitting these applications. And you can change employer, but you've got to consider that changing your employer is really just like, in many ways, a new employment visa application, certain from a procedural perspective, because when you get permissions to work under an employment visa, you get two privileges. You get the privilege to work for that particular employer on those nominated terms and conditions, and that's it. When you also get the privilege to reside, because the privilege to reside flows naturally from the privilege to work, because you've got to be able to live here to carry out your employment duties. And what you find in the foreign national community is a bit of confusion about how all this works. A lot of foreign nationals think that getting an employment visa once makes it transferable and you can go off and do whatever you want for any employer, but that's not true. Effectively, when you cease working for your existing employer, your privileges to work stop. But your privilege to reside continues until such a time as either the Immigration Department relieve you of your limit of stay, which they never do, or until your limit of stay expires, whereupon you're expected to leave. So whilst you're here with a retained privilege to reside, it's perfectly lawful to go and look for new employment and to interview for jobs, possibly engage in exploratory activities prior to starting your own business. But crossing the threshold from mere residing through to joining in or establishing a business or taking up a new employment requires the permission of the Immigration Department. And so if you are an existing employer sponsored by a third-party employer and you're looking for a new employer, complete all the recruitment parts of this exercise, and then you submit an application to change your sponsorship. The Immigration Department will apply the approvability test to those circumstances. If they think that it's justified to allow the change in employer, they'll approve the change of sponsorship application. They'll notify you in writing that the sponsorship application has been approved, and you're on your way. You can now take up that new employment. If, on the other hand, you're going to not work for another employer, but you're going to establish your own business or join in an existing business, then you have to make an application to change your visa category from sponsored employment through to business investment. And the test for approval, as we'll see, is slightly different. Well, it's considerably different in actual fact, but it is different, and there's different application consideration criteria that are in play in those circumstances. But you can't take up a new employment until you've got the permission of the Immigration Department accordingly, and you can't join in or establish a business until you've changed your category and secured the Immigration Department's approval accordingly. Does that make sense? Do you own the business, or are you merely going to work for it? Just a few moments ago I talked about this idea where people are going to incorporate their own business and they're going to extend a job offer to themselves, and all of a sudden the Immigration Department are going to buy into that. Well, actually, the bottom line is, doesn't matter how you dress it up, you can't self-sponsor as such. So the way the Immigration Department see it is, if you've got a new company situation and you own a piece of that company, or in fact it could be an existing company situation, but you own a piece of that company, they're going to look at it to see if you've got value at risk in the employer. That is, have you put any money in? What's going on in all the circumstances? Is this genuinely a third-party job offer from an independent third-party employer? You see, if they conclude that it isn't that situation, they conclude that you're really a business owner, even if you own just a portion of the business, they may decide that this is not an employment visa application per se. This is really a business investment visa application. Now, there's no hard and fast sort of, model that suggests if you've got this in play, then you're definitely an investor. If you've got this in play, you're definitely an employee. It's a very sort of flexible, amorphous glob. But if really what it looks like is this guy owns a piece of the action, and the reason why he's doing this work is because he owns a piece of the action, then really you can expect the Immigration Department to apply the business investment visa provability test rather than the employment visa provability test. And as you'll see, the difference between the two is quite marked in terms of what's required to expect an approval.
Yeah. Can I understand, because the employment side of immigration and the investment side, it's two different parts of the Immigration Department, or is it?
It's all on the 24th floor, and one side of the 24th floor is the business investment visa team, and the other side of the 24th floor is the employment visa team.
So if you put in the application as an employment visa application with these set of facts, it's still going to be processed through the employment department section as opposed to investment visa section. And so the criteria, although in principle it might be similar, but it's kind of different sort of officers looking at it, right?
Well, that's right. And so what they do is they look at it and they say, okay, given what we know about this business right now, should we be applying the investment visa provability test, or should we be applying the employment visa provability test? And it can have a big difference. I mean, there can be a big difference between the amount of time that it takes to finalize those applications, because the business investment visas normally take between 4 and 6 months to complete, whereas an employment visa will take usually 4 to 8 weeks to complete. But it doesn't matter how you dress it up, the Immigration Department will pore through it, and if they see that this is really an investment visa application, and it doesn't matter how you've dressed it up either, but yeah, if they see that it's a business investment visa application, they will apply the business investment visa provability test, notwithstanding.
So can you elaborate on how they differentiate these two types of tests? Say, for example, if you are a shareholder of the company, you own over 50%, and they definitely will apply the investment visa test. And then, so can you elaborate on, how can they just classify this two, and then finally, because the test is kind of completely different, right? For the employee, you need to prove you can't find locally that employee, right? For investment, they don't. They simply look at how much the company can contribute every year.
That's right. But a related question is, how old is the sponsor? See, if the sponsor is new, they're still going to apply the business investment visa test to it anyway. So I know you're looking for a hard and fast. Does this mean it falls on this side of the line, or does it mean does it fall on this side of the line? I can't give you a definitive answer. What I can say is, if it clearly appears to you that this guy is an investor in this business, rather than an independent employer-employee arm's length employment relationship exists, then you can expect the Immigration Department are going to apply the business investment visa provability test rather than the employment visa provability test. But sometimes you have scenarios where he's been given, say, 15% of the company in terms of equity grant after a certain amount of time in lieu of, say, foregone compensation. So in that situation, does the Immigration Department view him as an investor, or do they view him as an employee? It just really depends on all the circumstances. So it's not really hard and fast, and it's difficult to actually gauge sometimes which way the Immigration Department are going to view it. But what we do in practice is we say to the client, okay, what's going on? And more often than not, they're starting to think about this structure, and they haven't actually finalized it. And so we can give them advice as to how the Immigration Department might respond, and then they structure their affairs in such a way that we can actually get it into the employment visa class rather than the investment visa class. So it just depends. But there are other instances as well. Like, I've got a case on the go right now. It's a Russian gentleman. He's here with his family, and he's got half a dozen companies around the world, including a company in Russia. And what he's doing when he comes to Hong Kong, in actual fact, is he's investing. He's already got a company that was established about a year or so ago, and it's got some local employees, it's got an office, it's got turnover, it's got plans and what have you. But he wants to be in Hong Kong because he's going to put more money into it, because China's the next market for him. In that situation, we've made an application for him to be an intercompany transferee from his Russian company under the employment visa, because he's the CEO transferring in. so we can expect that his visa will get approved in 6 to 8 weeks. But actually, when you look at what's going on, he's actually a business investor because he's putting a lot of money in. You know, the capital of the company is going to be increased and all the rest of that good stuff. So we made a determination not to apply for a business investment visa. We made a determination to apply for an employment visa because we want the immigration department to conclude that he's an intercompany transferee employee rather than a business investor, because this guy only gets a 2-week limit of stay as a visitor when he comes as a Russian national. And with his family, he can't afford to be toing and froing across the border doing the Shenzhen shuttle for the next 6 months. So we structured it that way. So it's, you know, it's a difficult question to answer, but the answer presents itself when you've got the facts before you, in my experience. Yeah? Okay, great, good. Okay, so I say here, don't play games with the immigration department. They always get to the bottom of business ownership. And normally, you know, clients will come and they've heard on the rumour mill that you can do this and you can do that, and their friends said this and this has always worked, and why is it not going to work for me? And I always say, you know, forget that. You've got to you go to the immigration department with clean hands, disclose what's going on, give them an opportunity to say yes, and if it's worthy of the approval, they will say yes. The immigration department want to say yes. They don't want to throw logs at the feet of entrepreneurs, and they don't want to thwart the intentions of employers to augment the human capital pool of Hong Kong. Okay. Right, and as I say, if the situation generally stacks up, you'll definitely get an approval, in my experience.
I have a question about secondments. Is that a separate section, or it falls within employment? Secondment.
Into Hong Kong,
yes.
They're intercompany transferees.
Okay.
Yeah, and they normally get approved, no questions asked.
Right. Because sometimes we get asked, well, you know, can we have a third-party sponsor of someone seconding because they have a joint venture agreement? Like, you know, in construction industry, that happens.
Yeah, quite a lot.
And then so actually they're not being employed. Yeah. They're doing it on the back of a joint venture.
Yeah, and then the entity overseas doesn't actually employ the guy that's coming in because he's a contractor, and that's the way the industry's structured. And there's no employment nexus chain, and you can't actually make the connection between this particular individual and the way that the sponsorship is structured. I see it all the time. It's just, as I say, this is part of the beauty about practicing Hong Kong immigration, because every set of circumstances are different. But the way that I approach it is to say, right, okay, if we've got a de facto intercompany transferee situation, okay, how can we articulate to the immigration department that this is a de facto intercompany transferee, even though it's not a legal intercompany transferee situation? And even if, as we've got one case on the go right now, where we've got it's incredibly complex, but it's a government agency that's extended a contract to a joint venture that's half Chinese and half Burmese or something. It's very bizarre. And actually the people that are going to be providing the skills are Australians. And it's an Australian publicly listed company that's got a sub here that hasn't operated here for 6 years. And then the guys that they want to bring in are all very, very specialist technical talent, certainly not available in Hong Kong or probably anywhere in China for that matter. But they've all been providing their services to this publicly listed company as independent contractors themselves for more than a dozen years. So how the heck do you go from, you know, a scenario where we've got a regular intercompany transferee situation through this chain of entities to this point where the immigration department can say, all right, yeah, this entity can then be the sponsor for this because of, you know, these relationships, how it all stacks up. In that situation, you just lift up your skirt and show them everything. Just show the chain all the way through. And as long as you've got a valid sponsor at the Hong Kong end, and as long as it's done, the employment is on Hong Kong employment terms, as it has to be for the purposes of approval, as you can read in the Hong Kong Visa Handbook, then even though it's very unusual, if it's understandable and the information is there for the immigration department to make sense of it, then you'll say yes. Yeah.